Hello and welcome. And this is the first time I've gone live. I was apprehensive about it because there's so many YouTube channels out there about UFOs and conspiracies and cryptids and Bigfoot and Dogman, the Mandela effect, time slips, missing time, and I've had a lot of experience with many of these so-called phenomenons, and I say so-called because sometimes paranormal events are mimicked by corporations or governments. This is pretty much a summary of what I've learned in my 40 plus years of reading about subjects and getting to know people who have been involved with seeing UFOs firsthand, going inside them, seeing how they worked. Also, having direct run ins with what people perceive are aliens. So, yeah, I'm smoking. Not a good thing, but what the heck. So, I've been writing a book on this subject for a very long time. And it's proven more difficult to write over the years because I've been focusing on one case that has only been heard publicly twice, and the second broadcast recording of it was lost. But thankfully, I have the first one, and it's a story about my friend Chris and his experiences in the military. Excuse me, I have to relight. And what he experienced on the Air Force base he was stationed at in 1977 and 1978. But I'm not going to get into all that now. But I can tell you, it's not your usual UFO case. It's not an abduction in the sense that he was taken against his will. And so, on my quest really to find any correlation, now this all happened uh, on Shemya Air Force Base in Alaska. So, in 1977 and 78. So, in my research, I began to just only try to find sightings around that area as early as I could find. And at the time, and I haven't looked in quite a few years, and I've noticed the internet has sanitized a lot of what am I about to read you. Um, if you look up this case now, it's not a very well known case, but you can find it. But if you read the description now, it's more like a watered down, horrible Reader's Digest version of the report. But when I found the report, I not only found it from the source, but I also found a letter that he wrote to Martin Caden about his uh, sighting. Sorry, somebody dinged me and distracted me. See, there it is. All right. So his name was, I'll just read it to you. On March 29th, 1949, at 10:05 p.m., a USAF B-29 bomber crew reports a dull yellowish light flying at 2,400 feet. So that was the earliest. Uh, let's see. In January 1952, rigger Eldon L. White sighted a gray bat-shaped craft, 30 feet across, 300 foot above him, floating leaf-like towards the water. The leading edge of the wings was spaced with round openings emitting a greenish-yellow glow, a dome on top in the center, emitting a pulsating red glow from the inside. Underneath and rear of the wing was a long rod or shaft. The craft hovered 75 feet above the water a few seconds, then angled into a steep glide into the water. The craft never resurfaced. And the following is from a letter received by NICAP on April 4th, 1966. Did I say he wrote Martin Caden earlier? I was mistaken. He wrote Nightcap in reference Martin Caden. I think Martin Caden, it's been a while since I looked at this, so I'll just go on. Dear Sir, this is Eldon writing. Many times from many places I have postponed writing to you. I presumed even you would not believe my story. I write to you now because of an article I read recently in author Martin Caden's book Hydrospace, Chapter 2. In January 1952, while employed as a rigger on Shemya, a 2x4 island in the Aleutians, the following happened. It was my day off, and I was wandering around looking for blue foxborows, while a whirring, whining sound caused me to look up. About 300 feet above me, falling leaf-like towards the water, was a gray bat-shaped craft. It was about 30 feet across. The leading edge of its wing was spaced with round openings emitting a greenish yellow glow. The top center of the wing was a dome emitting a pulsating red glow from the inside. Underneath and aft of the wing was a long rod or shaft, about around 75 feet above the water. This craft commenced hovering for a few seconds and then fell into a steep glide and disappeared beneath the water. I gaped and waited quite some time for it to resurface, but it never did. In addition, in August 1949, while employed as a brakeman on the Alaskan Railroad, I sighted a similar craft minus the protruding rod or shaft. To conclude, I want you to know I have not mentioned either case to anyone over the years. Why? Perhaps hell. The scoffers said, Fox on Shemya, you're nuts, and blew at that. But, sir, the Fox are there. Imagine if I had used the verboten phrase UFO. Sincerely, Eldon L. White. So that's the earliest sighting. Oh, welcome in. Hello, hello. So that's the earliest sighting for a UFO that I could find actually on what became Shemya Air Force Base. If you look on the map of Alaska, it's the second to the last island on the Aleutian Island chain. Uh, the veterans like to say of Shemya, it's not the end of the world, but you can see it from here. Shemya, I believe, was named after a particular type of deity that they used to worship. My friend Brian knows a little bit more about that uh, entity and where the name comes from. The Russians nicknamed it Shemya Kinsud, which means in English, doorway to hell. Chris said that when he got to the island, above the 600 building where he lived, there was a sign in English and Russian that said doorway to hell. What a welcome to the military. So, I guess moving along, uh, UFOs, it's, I'll say, Reader's Digesting it, the evidence shows that they're built on Earth. There is really no evidence, actually none at all, that they come from other planets. Um, go back in our history, even ancient times. You think ancient man was stupid? No. And that's all I'll say about that, because that statement in itself pisses a lot of people off. You know, they want to be saved by some alien entity, you know, take a trip like Marshall Applewhite did with the Heaven's Gate cult back in '97. Yeah, I was in my, how old was I? 23? 23 when that happened. And I'll get into the Phoenix Lights sighting. I'll talk about that because I saw the Phoenix Lights. And that night, actually, that was March 13th, 1997. I got to relight. Excuse me, got to do it. So that was March 13th, 1997. Me and my buddy Tony were coming back from camping at a place called Seven Springs, way out there, Arizona. And I see the mail truck coming, so I don't know how loud he's going to be, so I'm going to wait. Come on, buddy. Anyway, um, we were driving down the Beeline Highway, headed towards Shea. Now, back then, that was the old Fort McDowell reservation out there by the Fort McDowell Casino. So as we're driving down the Beeline, we hit the light at Shea, and we're at the intersection, and we were in his Suzuki Jeep back then, the no top on it. You know, this is mid March; it was pretty warm, and I looked up, and over the mountain there, right at the intersection, comes this huge V-shaped craft with, you know, the lights underneath it, kind of formed a V. I looked up and I said, "What the hell is that?" Tony said, "That's a UFO." So as we make a right on Shea, so we're going, let's see, uh, shit, what direction were we going? East on Shea. So this would have been right in the Fountain Hills city limits, just the beginning of Fountain Hills back then. Still that way anyway. But so as we turned right, the craft turned with us. So now we got this thing on the driver's side, and flew along probably for less than a mile, and then it slowly veered off um, to the south. It would be like southeast towards South Mountain. And I don't know what time it was. I can't remember what time it was. Uh, we had been camping up there with our girlfriends for like, I don't know, 3 days. So we were pretty exhausted by the time, you know, we weren't expecting to see that. And then a few weeks later, the big news was the Heaven's Gate cult, you know, did their thing. And that was all over the news. And they were comparing it to Jonestown. And I forget what book it was, but one of the early books on UFOs in the 1980s, the author referenced Marshall Applewhite, leader of the Heaven's Gate cult, as one of the premier experts in the UFO field. And I wish I would have kept the book. We were doing a church fair, you know, trying to raise money for the church and donating books and whatever is one of those things. So I found it in a box that somebody donated, and had to put it out there for the little church bazaar sale or whatever. Didn't get to keep it, but I got to look through it. I thought that was funny. And phew, talk about Jim Jones. Yeah, going from one subject to the next. UFOs to Jim Jones. Uh, if you want a really good researcher on and a good history lesson on the 20th century, especially from the years 1963 to 1988. And Mae Brussel even covers, a little pre-World War One history. Uh, but she and about 11 other researchers are pretty much responsible for what's become known as the conspiracy genre, the research field, independent journalists, things like that. And I think I have her quote on my description of one of her radio programs where she states who they all are. And researching that, Babe Russell called it the hazards of doing research. And there really still is a hazard, as a lot of you probably know. And I think that's one of the reasons why I never wrote any books, why I never really got out there and investigated this stuff like some of the people that I've come to watch over the years online go from virtual unknowns to, they're out there with their channels and their core audiences and their followers, and that's fine. But when you watch these guys from normal Joes like you and me who don't really seek, to do it as a living, so to speak, but you just happen to have a story to tell and you've experienced a few things. And a lot of, I think, why people don't come forward is because they don't want to end up like a Jim Keith or a Mae Russell who contracted a fast acting cancer, or weird and untimely deaths of people who used to run independent mags like Steam Shovel Press back in the early 90s. I remember reading a interview with Timothy Leary and Paul Krasner, and I think it was 92, and they were talking about digital eye dosers and hypnotizing the kids with binaural beats in the computer. This was 92, and that only became popular within the last decade. And Larry's in that interview saying, "Yeah, we're gonna control a whole new generation of kids," and Paul Krasner's just like, "Yeah," and he's kind of, I'll say it, poo-pooing all over the researchers. And I'm not talking, I'm talking people that come up with declassified documents, stuff that's tangible you can hold in your hand. That's just not some guy told me. So Krasner took a total 180, if you call it that, and was old hanging out with the old CIA agent Timothy Leary. Leary admitted to being a CIA agent. Part of the interview is in one of his books. I forget which one it was. I think it was Mass Control, Engineering, Human Consciousness, if I remember right. But Larry Larry was basically put there by the CIA to disperse the LSD. It's a known fact, really. Now, when it came to that, what a lot of people don't know, and I still think they don't know. I mean, a lot of people knew back then, like May Brussels, there were two different types of acid going around back then. The natural stuff, uh, let's see, sorry, the natural LSD that wasn't causing um, schizophrenia or signs of schizophrenia, things like that. It was, I don't know, it was the government acid that was making people sick, basically. And so I was giving a link out. And so you come across, well, May comes across this declassified government document in 1976. And she talks about this report twice on her program. I think the first broadcast on it was November 21st, 1976. And then the second one was September 5th, 1977. And in the first report, she goes through uh, sorry, I'm trying to do two things at once. Probably lose my train of thought. But yeah, I did. What the hell was I saying? That's what happens when you try to do two things at once. So I know I was talking about Nate Russell, but I'm trying to think because I know I was on something good there, but uh, oh yeah, the mind control thing. Okay, took me a minute. The first report goes through the funds that were allocated by the government to the hospitals, colleges, and other institutions and uh, dummy front corporations that really didn't exist, uh, down to the dollar. They didn't round this stuff off. And then the second broadcast, she goes through what some of the drugs were that were used, what their goals were, what their purpose was. Like one I remember, the government wanted to find a K agent, is what they called it, a knockout agent, an aerosol that they could spray around somebody and either knock them out or incapacitate them. Another one was another spray aerosol type of drug that they could spray around somebody and it would blank out their memory. You could tell them to go do something, they'd go do it, and then the effects would wear off, and then they wouldn't remember who they were, not who they were, but that missing time, they might show up somewhere else, or maybe, if it was directed, put, the subject put back in the same place. Then you hear of like, years later, the cases that may or not even be related to that type of experiment, but you hear people going missing. I don't know. One time, I'm just walking along there in the woods. Next thing I know, I'm laying down facing the water. David Politis covers cases like that on his channel all the time. So if you like missing person cases and unusual disappearances, uh, you may or may not know of him, but his YouTube is Can-Am Missing Project, David Politis, and I've met him once when he came here to speak in Arizona, and got somebody who's trying to view me, and YouTube's not letting them do it. Let's see, how do you share this? No, timestamps, community. Oh, here we go. All right. Let's see. Try this one. All right. Anybody nobody in chat other than Sandra. Hello, Sandra. Sorry I didn't see you there earlier. So May got into that particular report in those broadcasts. You know, it's pretty amazing for a researcher to pretty much hit on every major news story from the Kennedy assassination all the way until almost about the end of the Reagan administration. Her last broadcast was June 13th, 1988. And, you know, a lot of people forget, even in people who research this stuff, sometimes I don't know where they're looking. And that's why I really kind of apprehensive about the channel, because um, I don't want to say it'd be any different from anything else, but I don't know. I was going to say something, lost it again. um, but yeah, back to Mae Brussels, since I know a lot about her, and really, if you know, not I don't think everything she said was. I don't know. She may have been wrong about some stuff, but she really had a knack for predicting future presidents. That's for sure. She got a few things wrong, but she predicted that what I think Jimmy Carter and Reagan and even George Bush as president. Not really in any order of succession, but pretty accurate. You know, if you listen to her stuff from the early '80s, it sounds like a lot of the stuff that's going on now, like in the Middle East. But so for years it used to tick me off when people would say, "Oh, the mind control, that's all bullshit." It just tells me they didn't read, they didn't research, and they were just doing research, or so to speak, getting their news from somebody else, I guess. Oh, hi, Tessa. Welcome. So, that's the thing about doing research. It can be hazardous to your health. And if you piss off the wrong person, or if people just simply don't like what you're saying because it goes against their whole worldview, and some of you know all what that's about, you know. But she even did a show on it called "The Hazards of Doing Research," October of '78, and the amount of things that happened to this woman. Like one night, she's at home and she gets a call from the supposed Santa Cruz Police Department, I think it was, and stating that they arrested her daughter on marijuana charges, and to come down to the police station and pick her up. And May was like, "Well, I don't know why I'd have to pick her up. She's over 21. She should, she should be in her college classes." So May says, "Well, I had a radio interview to do, and I called the police station back to tell them that I was going to be about an hour late, and she shouldn't worry, and that I'll be there." And the cops were like, "We didn't call you." So she called around for to a few more law enforcement agencies, and no sergeant, whatever she named, existed. Nobody arrested her daughter, and her daughter was found where she should have been, in her college night classes. So they were trying to lure her out of the house, after 9 at night. Another one was I told my friend Sandra about this one. Uh, she had some, I guess, property on Vancouver Island, Canada. So she would take the kids there and vacation and camp and take the trailer and whatnot. So one morning they woke up, and when they went to open the food box, there was a rattlesnake in the food box. So when they just left everything there. She says we left the food box and the camping tent and all the gear there. The trailer was already hitched up from the night before. We just got in the car and drove off. She goes, then our friends made fun of us because there are no rattlesnakes on Vancouver Island. And they didn't believe May, thought she was making it up. And another time she was leaving the house, she said, and where she lives, I guess there's a big mile-long hill that goes, like steep. And she says, I decided to stop at, before I got down that hill at the gas station to kill some time. And she says, when I pulled out, the tires pretty well, the fenders came down and hit the tire. And she said, so I circled and talked to the mechanic there and found out that the control arm bolts were taken out. And he said the only way that could happen if somebody could actually get inside your car to pop the trunk to do all this stuff. She's like, that's when I started to lock my car. I'm like, so she says, if I would have went down that hill, I would have lost all control of the car. She's talking about flights delayed and other things like that. And then, you start getting into the 90s of the people who picked up on her research, uh, or even started their own thing, like Danny Casolaro in the I think it was late 80s and early 90s, was investigating this Promise software and security software that government had, and I guess was selling to other governments, but there was a back door into it where you could spy. So Casolaro was investigating all this, and then he was suicided in his hotel room. And then about 91, between 91 and 93, the new author Jim Keith comes out. He writes one called Banned and Suppressed in the USA. OK Bomb, I think that came out around the time of the Oklahoma City fiasco. He took a lot of Mae Brussels' research and wrote the Keystone. No, not the Keystone. The Key to the Skeleton. The Skeleton Key to the Gemstone Files. That's what it was. It took me a minute. It's been a while since I've read these books. But all he did for that book was, I don't know how. I know there were copies of Bruce Roberts' Gemstone File going around in the 70s. And the only person with a complete set of them was over 300 papers was Mae Brussels. Supposedly there were 1,000 pages to this document, but only 300 existed that Bruce Roberts himself gave to Mae Brussels, I think in 1972. And then he wrote a 20-page summary of the Gemstone File, and she went through it and deduced what was pretty much fiction and misinformation to what was real and factual. So Keith takes this writing and he throws it all together in his book. And it's a nice summary of the Gemstone File. It's at some points it kind of reads like a spy novel. Uh, Bruce Roberts talked about a bar, I forget, somewhere in L.A. maybe, if I remember right, that the spy agents used to go to and hang out, and, whatever. And then the story was the bartender got killed, whatever. And then May said that she herself went to this bar poking around. She said she had people. She said one time a guy showed up. I don't know if it was her neighbor or somebody, but he tried putting up on her roof, right in front of her, this huge, like, radio antenna. She said this thing was massive. She says, "Look, if you want to spy on me and put something on the house," she says, "at least have the decency to do it when I'm not home. Don't sit here and do it in front of my face. I don't want that thing on my house." And one story I read online, I think this was from one of her friends. I'm not sure, but on one of her fiascos, she was pulled aside at the airport and interrogated. Her luggage went through, and she said she started feeling kind of sick. And somebody mentioned that, well, because the way she described it, they had her sit in a certain spot in the room, positioned a certain way, told not to move, that sort of thing. And somebody said that, I don't know how true this is, that they were irradiating, throwing radiation at her through the wall, whatever. And years later, she ended up with one of these fast-acting cancers that she always would report on, like Jack Ruby. She said Jack Ruby begged, to sing about who did it, and they wouldn't let him. They wouldn't take him to Washington. You know, she goes into a lot of this stuff that even a lot of researchers now that talk about JFK or whatever don't go into. They don't go into the two Oswalds, the doubles. She actually met an Oswald double in the mid-70s. You wouldn't have the rifle theory without his wife. She was Alec Idell on the card. Um, he wasn't a loner like a lot of people said. When people would call on him to come out, he would always politely decline them. He wrote John Connolly for, I think, a job recommendation or something like that. He knew John Connolly, at least in some fashion. Um, so who knows? Uh, One of the interesting stories about that is how in the movie theater, the one that was arrested was taken out the front, and at first they threw a thing over his face. And then the second Oswald, who was actually in the balcony, got escorted out either the side or the back of the theater because some of these researchers back then got a hold of the cop that actually arrested uh, one of the Lee Harveys and took him out the back. And forget the guy's name, but there was another good researcher, good author about the whole Oswald Tippit killing and how two Oswalds could play into that. When they found the wallet and all that kind of stuff in his jacket, I think in the parking lot. So it's a lot of good information in there. A lot of book titles she talks about. Um, Stuff that's, if you look on eBay, that you still can find, but you're going to pay a pretty penny for it. Like the book by Louis Tackwood called The Glass House Tapes. That one's about the plan to kill Richard Nixon. And he said he was the 14th highest ranked agent provocateur in the government. And when they got the orders to do this assignment, he blew the whistle on it and wrote a book. And if you look for that book, it's well over $100 on eBay. Some of Jim Keith's works on eBay most of them are very affordable, anywhere from $5 to $20. But a couple of titles, for whatever reason, and I'm guessing it's the subject matter of mind control, uh, they've shot up over $100 per copy on eBay suddenly over the last few years. The first title by his is Mind Control, World Control. And then his follow-up is Mass Control, Engineering, Human Consciousness by Jim Keith. And that's a lot of good factual stuff about what scientists were doing. He references, I think it's Pavlov's dog experiment way back, the German experiments. And then goes into Dr. Jolly West and what was the other guy's name? Jolly West and I can't remember, but Delgado, that's it, Jose Delgado. Dr. Jolly West and Jose Delgado was probably the most heinous doctors, if you want to call them that, out there, what they did to people. I think it was Dr. Cameron, Ewing Cameron, I think that was his name. He'd put people in vegetative states for months on end. He'd turn people into mush. He'd force them to sleep, and then when they wake up, he'd give them drugs and put them back to sleep. And he kept doing that month after month after month. Yeah. Therapy, better living through chemicals. And when they talk about putting electrodes in subject's head, putting electrodes in homosexuals' heads, trying to turn them straight. Uh, there was this one experiment talked about on this 9-year-old boy. Who I think it was Delgado that hooked up electrodes into this kid's brain, and Delgado had a box, and if you push a button on the box, the kid would start being confused about his gender, whether he was a boy or a girl, telling Delgado that he was in love with him. Delgado would push another button and the behavior would stop and the kid would go back to normal. They were doing experiments to see if they could turn people gay as well as make gay people straight. I mean, this is some far out, heinous stuff that Keith gets into and pretty much exposes. And story on him is he attended the Burning Man in 1999, and he fell from the stage and broke his knee. But Jim, being stubborn, didn't go right to the hospital. He went home. And his knee got worse and worse as the days went on. So he was admitted to the hospital, and he told close friends around him that he said, "Don't let him put me under because I don't think I'm going to make it back out." Like, what? And he talked to the doctor and the anesthesiologist. And this is from stuff I've read on the net over the years, people who knew him, I guess to say underground news stories, not really major press, although it did get some minor press when it happened. But there was only supposed to be a local anesthetic on his knee, just and him awake, and that didn't happen. And one of his friends said that this is interesting, and you can't find this anywhere. So if you find this in your, if you're an internet sleuth, Keith did an interview with MSNBC in 1997 about chemtrails, and this connects to his death in a very odd way. So one of his friends who was there when Keith was at the hospital, he said one of the orderlies, or a guy that was dressed like an orderly, was the same guy that was in this interview with Keith he was a pilot of one of these airplanes that sprayed the chemtrails, and of course he was there to debunk it. But he said that orderly was the same guy, was the pilot. So I'm curious to know, and I've tried looking for the footage. I can't find this MSNBC Jim Keith interview anywhere. And really, if you try to look for his stuff online, the internet in the last 25 years, say 30 years, has done a great job at wiping out a lot of information, even on archive.org. They've done it. I don't know if it's because they're losing space and they have to, or what, but that's why a lot of this stuff that I've researched is really old. It comes from the internet. A lot of it for the book I'm writing is coming from eyewitness accounts on military veteran message boards. and not really private, since anybody could click on a link and you know read the posts. So a lot of the information that I found on Shemya, getting back to that, jumping back to UFOs again, comes from a lot of these Shemya veterans who were stationed on the island between 1978 and I said 79. I just put an extra year in there just because that those years were really hotbeds for UFO activity in that area. I think Newsweek covered a story about it back in '77, but kind of watered it down. But like I have statements from veterans, multiple veterans, who saw the same sighting. And then going into that, one of the sightings was the UFOs were flying around Shemya so much that the soldiers were basically hanging out on the airport runway, kind of sitting there by the cliff, watching these things go in and out of the water. And one of the security guys who was on this message board says, I kept the original report because Colonel Soxy made me rewrite it when I mentioned the UFOs. He said Soxy was so angry that he kept being woken up, because this went on for a span of days, for like a week or so, maybe a little more. So it got to be where Soxy was being woken up, at all ungodly hours because of these UFOs. So he storms into I think it was a tactical operations room. He says, look, don't wake me up again unless they land and get out. He goes, if they get out of their craft, then wake me up. Otherwise, leave me alone. And what I've come to know about Shemya is there's only there was only two people on that whole island who were in charge of I'll say the UFO reports that they got, and all those reports were immediately uh, sent to um, what is it, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. So there's a connection there, right? Anybody who's been researching UFOs for over 30 years knows something about Wright-Patterson, usually connected to Roswell, if I recall correctly. But it got to be where when I met Chris, he was stationed. Well, he wasn't stationed at Shemmy when I met him. He was stationed there in '77 and '78. But I backtracked from that. From there, basically, I went on message boards back then, which a lot don't, like I said, don't exist anymore. So I'm glad I printed all this up and kept it. Uh, I wanted to find if anybody knew Chris, and I found a few people that did. And his experience goes a tad bit further than just sitting out there watching these things dive in and out of the ocean. Um, excuse me a minute, I got to get something because take a drink of my tea. Oh, sorry, I'll be right back. Can you hear the wind chimes? Sorry about that. I just really don't like. I don't know. I'm new with the camera thing, and I probably rambled on long enough. But Chris's case, like I said, was going into way more than that, and it goes into basically who at the base knows exactly what these things are, where they come from. Uh, so I'll be talking about that in my book and a little bit tidbits of his experience here and there on this channel. Um, I'll tell you this much: over the years, I've met a lot of so-called, and I say so-called, is because I'll just say a lot of UFO researchers and a lot of authors, and I got to be friends somewhat with one of them over the years, and in this whole research thing and doing this, and you watch other people do it, you realize that in anything, there's always a power control group. There's always a group of researchers that are always gonna get the speaking engagements, gonna get the invites, gonna get the media invites, gonna be on shows like Strange but True or you know Ripley's Believe It or Not. And then the other guys, then they're the ones on the outside that really nobody knows about, who may have a good solid case and they get ignored or simply uh, not believed. And you really have to sit back from a good distance and really examine what's going on when it comes to the UFOs and the so-called aliens. Uh, the evidence is there. People have been screaming about disclosure for what 50 for years now, right? And my contention is they're already disclosing it to you when they're showing you the films, when they're showing you photos of UFOs. So, I remember there was a, I don't know if it's real even to this day, it looked real, but I think it was the Argentina sighting in 2010 where the guy zooms in and you see the aliens in the windows of the craft. It's plausible. I can't remember if I ever showed Chris that footage or not. Unfortunately, my friend Chris, who experienced all this, is no longer with us. He passed away last year in November. And another reason why it's taken a long time to write it and get to it is because a lot of times I sit down to write it and something that would happen in my life that I couldn't devote time to it, or I would start writing it a certain way and uh, it didn't flow right because Chris's experience only relies on his conscious memory of what happened. He never underwent hypnosis like a lot of people do who have the misfortune of running into these ugly things, ugly and stinky things. Chris said they stink like rotten meat. And he said their skin, uh, he said the ones that he saw were pale white, like an albino human, just white skin. And you could see their veins in their arms and their torso. He said the only reptilian thing about them was like the top of their heads. He said they had teeth, more like serrated edges, you know. They did have teeth. And one of the biggest lies out there about the UFO thing when it comes to communication with these non human entities is telepathy. They don't use telepathy, they can't read your thoughts, they can't get into your head. The only time that they can read your thoughts is if you open your mouth. When Chris talked with Baritone, that's what he named this particular alien. Baritone said, When Baritone talked to him, Chris said, "Oh, you actually talk." He says, "What do you think we use ESP?" He goes, "No, no, 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 no." He goes, "You humans are stupid." He goes, "That's like a form of hypnosis we put on you guys." He says, "No, we talk just like you." So as we unravel this mystery, this virtual unknown case that I'd say 99% of people who haven't heard yet, except for some of my close friends who I've talked to about it over the years, they've endured hearing me talk about this crap for years. And it's, to me, it's an old subject. And I'm really writing the book about it because it'll probably be my only UFO book. I really have no interest in the subject anymore because I know what they are. A lot of people out there already know what they are. I'll save it for the book. I'm not going to tell you what I have come to know what they are, even where the craft come from and where they're built. You know, the evidence is there, and that's what I like about Mae Brussels. She even discussed the UFO thing. Admiral Byrd in Operation High Jump really dug into it. You know, information that a lot of people don't talk about or even bring up. They like to somehow tie Admiral Byrd to the hollow Earth theory. Well, that's a load of crap. You never flew through the hollow Earth. Mm-mm. Hollow Earth, I think people confuse it with. It's much more widely known now. This top secret information. You could actually watch the film on YouTube that was taken of it back then by Admiral Byrd. But back in the 50s and before that, it was still uh, known information. After 1957, this what I'm about to tell you about Antarctica that Admiral Byrd discovered became top secret classified information. So if you ever so are inclined to go on eBay and try to locate an original copy with map included, make sure the map is included of the September 1957 issue of National Geographic. There you will see on the map a place called Bunger Hills. Wait for this car to pass. As I was saying, Bunger Hills on the map. And in red ink, it states right there, and if I can remember the quote, here is 300 square miles of round, green, and brown rolling hills, a real inner arms of the sea. So this is the place that Byrd found that the temperatures got as high as 70 degrees. There was vegetation, there was no snow around. And he also states this very briefly in an interview that you can actually see on YouTube. He talks about on the other side, I think, of Little America on the south, if I remember right. There's a whole other, he described it as continent or land, just as big as the United States. But in Brussels research, he goes a little further into what Byrd said and his associates and some of the books and things that were written then. That Antarctica had enough natural resources to sustain the planet for hundreds of years: coal, gold, silver, copper. I mean, anything you can think of. One of the expeditions, they could actually walk up to the mountain, take their pickaxe, and just clunk out a chunk of coal right there in their hand. And that's why it's so heavily guarded. It's because of the natural resources, and it's because of what the Nazis were working on as far back as the 1920s. Because Hitler and his buddies, they've been going down there since the late 20s, all throughout the 30s. I think it was a guy named Dr. Van Ribbentrop talked about in 1942 how Antarctica was going to be their secret hidden base, a place to retreat if the Allies had won. So they were planning for that as early as 1942. Hitler was going down there. They were they were manufacturing and working with the non the, the aliens. We'll just call them aliens for now. And the Nazis would build them, and them and the aliens would fly them. And this is what Byrd encountered down there. Uh, I think he left in December of '46 with his fleet. I think he had an 8 months food supply. By March of '46, he was, I think, back. He did an interview in the El Churio, I believe it was called, Chilean newspaper, about these flying discs that could fly from pole to pole within a matter of minutes. And that World War II was not over, that he had found Hitler's last bunker, basically, his last hideout, and that we're going to need more military reinforcements because they got craft that we can't take down. He reports this to James Forrestal, Secretary of Defense, I think he was. Forrestal reports it to his superiors. And then Forrestal was suicided, like they said, bad acid trip. It was similar to that other doctor who jumped out of the Bethesda uh, hospital window, Dr. Olson. So if you looked at Dr. Olson's death and you look at James Forrestal's death, they're damn near identical of how they died. So May references a book about Forrestal and goes more into that in that broadcast. But so Byrd didn't know at that time that the American government had already started bringing over, by 47. Uh, on July, I think it was on July 4th, 1947, he gave another interview to the El Churio, the Chilean newspaper. And ironically, what happened the day before that on July 3rd? Roswell crash. Imagine that, the same week. You got Byrd down there screaming and crying about UFOs and how World War II ain't ended. Forrestal gets whacked out. He's silenced and shut up because they did put him in a hospital. He got out. Yeah, they tried to make him look like he was nutso. Shortly after that interview that you can find on YouTube with Admiral Byrd, 1957, he died. He died before. I forget what month of '57, but he didn't last too long after that. So Byrd was under the assumption that, he had backup from the government. The government's like, no, we're working with them now, but he couldn't let Byrd know that. At least not that I know of. And a lot of information is suppressed from Admiral Byrd in his notes and his stuff is because of his family. It's not really a government conspiracy that way. By 1947, that's when the CIA started, and that was an offshoot of the OSS. We literally brought these guys here, Werner von Braun and a bunch of them. They threw these Nazi guys into teaching roles at universities, heads of corporations, labs, science labs, aerospace and technology. Shit. The water is so murky and mucky, and only now are basically people are coming to the light going, oh, this stuff might be real. Over the years, you present them this information, and they're like, but so I think that's it with Operation High Jump. I don't think it was Hollow Earth. Although I do find this, I think here's a big what if. What if Roswell was a direct retaliation because of Admiral Byrd flying down there in early 1947. How else would the UFOs know where to go? That, I think, was what, the 509th Bomb Group, the only nuclear base. I think that's where the nuclear, what, was made. And isn't it ironic or coincidental that that's what was? Well, that's where they crashed. I want to say attacked, but there's really no evidence for that anyway. Although Chris did get into Roswell, of what Baritone told him about Roswell, but I'll save it because it correlates with a lot of, I think, what Stanton Friedman wrote, because there were two crashes actually. The crash at Corona and then one near Roswell. So you had two separate groups witnessing. But the big mystery is, though, well, I can't say. I almost did. I almost gave it away. But nope. But yeah, I'll just say they pretend. I think the army who picked up the Roswell pieces and the bodies, I really think that those people thought that they were aliens. They did not have the security clearance to know what they really are and where they come from. I don't even think Raimi, the guy who directed To Cover It Up, knew what they really are and who really builds the UFOs. I'll say modern UFOs are offshoots of Tesla technology, uh, but I think, as you know, I think mankind has been building them for centuries. I think they all come from here. There's no direct evidence they come from any other planet. But hey, and I think that's about it now. I think I'll end the stream. I don't know how long I've been on, but I hope you enjoyed it. So yeah, we'll go into the book a little more. Maybe I'll discuss kind of, if I talk about politics or anything like that, it'll probably be old politics. Probably nothing really current. Kind of burned out on it. You know, like I said, there's a lot of channels out there now covering conspiracy, and I've heard some wacky ones. Some that I'd watch. I don't know. I just kind of burnt out on the whole thing, but it's nice to see people are finally waking up a little bit. But like I said, you got to be careful with your research, especially with this case. Chris had talked about, and I name him in the book, but I won't name him here. There was a major researcher that he talked to about his case, and then after we went on John B. Wells' radio show in 2015, he got harassing phone calls, not only on his publicized number, but his unprivate number, well, his private number that he said only a few people had. And he got so mad that he actually wrote an email and called the John B. Wells show and asked them if they gave out his personal information, the known number, not the private one. And they told him, no, why would we do that? And Chris was rather upset about it. And he says, this researcher, he goes, it comes from the so-and-so camp. And I said, was it this researcher himself? He goes, no, it was people who represented him. And I asked Chris, I said, well, represented him in a kind of like a formal fashion, like officially, or represent him in like a fan fashion? And he said more like a follower fan fashion. So I guess they didn't like what Chris had to say about his experience. But on one hand, that's what I found very interesting over the years is I would contact well-known researchers and authors, people who would beg for cases. And I'd bring up Chris's military case and they wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. They wouldn't. They wouldn't get back to me. The only one who did back then was John B. Wells. And even he on that broadcast started his first words out of his mouth were woo, woo woo, which we all know slang is slang for bullshit or something wacky and way out there. So he's already set the tone subconsciously for your mind of what you're about to hear is a bunch of bullshit. That's what I took from it. I'm on the phone listening to that, and of course, they don't have us live on the air yet, so they can hear us, but the audience can't hear us, right? And I said, "This ain't bullshit, John." That's what I said. I said, "I hope you can hear me." I said, "This ain't woo." Then he goes and he plays these really weird ass songs during the commercial break that have UFO connotations to them. Like one of them was something something from whatever planet, you know. And and I think at the outset, I don't think he thought we were lying, or that Chris was lying, I should say. But as as John said, he says, "Are you guys receiving any blowback?" No, nobody knows who the hell we are. Nobody cares. This is just one case out of thousands. But out of those thousands, there are a few that I found through some old researchers in their books that correlate with Chris's experience and his conversations with Baritone. I will tell you that his whole meeting with Baritone was 3 days long. And if we want to talk about the missing time aspect of it, Chris only remembered probably, he said, maybe 12 hours out of the whole 72. Um, the interrogation by the general afterwards, he says, it scared him pretty good. The threats that they made against him. Here's a fun, interesting fact, though, that I did find out. So, everybody, well, most people have heard of Stanton Friedman, the UFO researcher and author. Well, I have met Stan many times between 1998 and his death in 2018. Probably about 4 or 5 times. Talked to him on the phone a lot. Uh, did a couple interviews with him when I used to have a radio show many moons ago. Forgot what I was saying. But getting back, like I said, getting back to all these researchers that I contacted, nobody would touch it. Uh, and oh, I remember what I was saying about Stanton. So Stanton was always accused by somebody of being a government agent or a shill, something along those lines. And Stanton always maintained that the only time he ever worked for the government is when he worked for the post office. Well, getting to know Chris's case, when I mentioned Stanton Friedman to Chris said to me, "Hey, as long as it's not the Stanton Friedman that's in the CIA." I go, "Excuse me?" He said, yeah. He says he was stationed at Shemya in the tactical operations room because his office was, or by the tactical operations room, if I remember right. He said, yeah, this guy was fastidious about his nails and he always wore a crew cut. So when I sent him a picture of Stanton Friedman, the researcher, he said, no, that's not him. Same name, two different men. So could it be somewhere along the lines these last 40 years, going on 50 now? Because if we really look back at Stan's career, it started in the late 70s with the whole documentaries and stuff like that. So if you look back at the 50 years, um, he certainly developed a script. I'll tell you that much. I mean, if you look at a documentary from 77, and then if you look at a documentary from 97, and then 2007, and then 17, he's spouting the same script. Same script. So, but my focus was more on uh, formulating my own what I think is going on with the whole phenomenon, which would, again, probably make a lot of people mad. But what's so delicate about the UFO alien thing is it always seems to cross over into the spiritual side of it. Always. And not for the good. People claim that they can summon UFOs and channel this and channel that. Sit back down. No, I'm not poo-pooing on the whole idea. All I'm saying, there's a lot of fakers out there, and you don't want to mess with the real stuff. You don't want to mess with the real supernatural. You don't want to go ghost hunting. You don't want to do EVP sessions at the graveyard. Why invite that into your life? It'll wreak havoc in ways you never thought of. And I even see it now. I mean, people worshiping these things. Heck, there's people out there that worship AI now. That's a whole other subject that I don't even want to get into or touch right now. Oh my. Whew. But I'll leave y'all with that. And been on for how long now? Hour and 18 minutes. I guess we'll wrap it up. That's about long enough. I'm glad that you guys are decided to stop by. Hope the audio was all right. Hope everything worked out okay. And let's see, where's my mouse? My cursor likes to disappear. There it is. But you all have a great day, morning, afternoon, night, wherever it is, wherever you may be. And I'll talk to you next time.